Welcome back to Web Yeshiva's Halakhic Man, studies in the classic essay by Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik. I'm Rabbi Jeff Sachs of Atid and the Web Yeshiva, and our series is sponsored in memory of Rabbi Ezra Labatanze for Tzadik Lebracha by our friends and students Michael and Tiffany Beda. We have been working our way through the Rav's Ish Halacha, and now we've come to a very interesting section. I'm going to give some background to the section, and we'll take a look at parts of it, although I'm not certain that we're going to study this chapter 9 in the same kind of depth that we've been doing, the kind of close reading we've been doing for the previous chapters. At the end of the 8th chapter of part 1 of Halakhic Man, here at the bottom of page 48, in the discussion of how Halakhic Man views the world and what the purpose of Halakha is, and how Halakha manifests itself in the world, and how the world, the created world, the cosmos, the universe that we occupy, the physical reality that we occupy, is in fact the playing field for Halakha, the space in which Halakha is actualized. So then that is liable to help us orient how we're meant to view the world that we live in. And there's a very sharp distinction between the view of Halakhic Man, this archetypal character that we've been trying to understand, and Homo religiosus, religious man. And the Rav introduces the idea of TZIMTZUM, the Kabbalistic notion of God's contracting himself. That is an interesting discussion about what the Rav is doing by marshaling these Kabbalistic sources. As he does here, there's a parallel discussion about TZIMTZUM in the Rav's important essay, Uvikashtem Misham, which has been translated as "And from there you shall seek him," published by the Torah Rav Foundation, translated posthumously. Bikashtem Misham is also a kind of parallel essay to Halakhic Man, and because it was only translated in the last year or two, it's less well known. But even amongst Hebrew readers, it's a far less well known essay than the Halakhic Man or the Lowly Man of Faith, certainly. And there's a parallel discussion there of TZIMTZUM, and doing some different things with it there. But there's a discussion of what is the Rav doing, the same way that we can ask questions about what is the Rav doing by marshaling the philosophical literature, general philosophy. What is he doing by bringing in Hasidic or Kabbalistic literature? Is it really a kind of exposition of Kabbalah? The Rav was not, Rabbi Soloveitchik was not a Kabbalist, although like most well-learned, well-read Talmidei Chachamim, he had more than a passing knowledge of it, but he was far from what we would think of as a Kabbalist. And there's an interesting discussion in a book, a collection of essays called, here it is, the collection of essays is called Emunah B'Zmanim Mishtanim, Faith in Changing Times. It's a collection of essays. It was put out, it was one of the earlier collections of posthumous works that was put out, but works that were put out after the Rav passed away. It's essays about the Rav's philosophy, edited by Avi Sagi. There's an essay by Professor Lawrence Kaplan, who happens to be the translator of Halakhic Man. The essay is called, here you have it, Motivim Kabbaliim B'Haguto Shel Rav Soloveitchik, philosophical motifs in the thought of Rabbi Soloveitchik, Mashmutiim o Ituriim, substantive or decorative. When the Rav quotes Kabbalistic notions, is it because he's really doing some kind of substantive analysis and that he's doing a kind of borrowing of those notions into his own thought and exposition of Jewish philosophy, or are they there as a kind of metaphorical language, a kind of I don't want to say window dressing, but a kind of shorthand, but not the kind of real substantive borrowing. And Professor Kaplan writes about our passage, "B'masato Isha Halakha," in the Isha Halakha, in the Halakhic Man, Mishtamesh Rav Soloveitchik b'Rayon HaTzimtzum. Rav Soloveitchik discusses this topic of Tzimtzum, which he introduces at the end of chapter 8 and spends all of chapter 9 on. B'muvano harabani hamikori. He's not using Tzimtzum in the Kabbalistic notion, this notion of contraction, which I described last week. I'll define it again momentarily. But he's doing it in the earlier Midrashic Bilti Kabbali, non-Kabbalistic sense. The Muvan Shel Tzimtzum. Lo mimakom ela el makom. Not God contracting himself from a space, but pouring forth himself into a place. Tzimtzum shel yirida. God entering the world. Now again, the Kabbalistic notion of Tzimtzum, was something like this. Before the creation, and this is the Kabbalistic notion as put forth by the Arizal, Lurianic Kabbalah. I do not purport to be an expert in these matters, and presumably you all have access to various popular expositions of Kabbalistic thought, some of which are worth reading and others are worth avoiding. Prior to creation, God existed in the entirety. The non-physical existence that created before. Remember, when we say about creation, we don't mean the creation of the planet Earth on which we are all spinning at the moment. Right? But it's the idea that when we talk about the creation of the world, we're not talking about the creation of the planet Earth, as if the cosmos existed and then our planet was formed, although that may be the way it actually happened, both according to scientists and according to the Jewish worldview. When we talk about creation, we're talking about the creation of matter, and before creation is a time in which there was just vacuum. There was no physical form. In order for God to create a physical cosmos, since prior to that he filled the entirety of everything, which is a kind of paradoxical thought, because everything had no place. There was no physical. It's not like there's a box and the box contained a vacuum. Because if there's a box which contains a vacuum in which we then create something, that presupposes the existence of the borders of the box. But prior to the creation of matter, there was just God. Although I don't pretend to understand in what form he existed then, just as I can't imagine to pretend to understand in what form he exists now. In order for creation to come into being, God had to contract himself as it were. Those three words, as it were, kavayochol, which is a kind of way of saying whatever it means is what it means, but what it doesn't mean is not what it means. God had to contract himself in order to create space for the universe to be formed, for the cosmos to be formed. That is the act of Tzimtzum in the Kabbalistic notion. The Rav is not exactly using the term in that way. He's using it more in the conventional Midrashic way. And he points to the following Midrash. The Midrash is based around this pasuk, or these psukim in Eov, In Eov, there's a pasuk when Eov is trying to understand Job, the book of Job. When he's trying to understand how God runs the world and why the righteous such as himself suffer, and how does God keep his bookkeeping to know who's righteous and who's wicked, and he's questioning how this could have all befallen him. One of his friends, Elihu, who probably represents the most Jewish of the worldviews that are presented by the friends of Eov, Elihu tells Job, Shakai. See this word? That's one of those really holy names of God. So holy that we don't generally pronounce it the way that it's written. Lo mitzanuhu. Sagi koach. God, we can't imagine him. We can't fathom him. We spent a lot of time talking about this a while back when we studied the Rambam's Hakdama Perek Halakhic. Our ability to imagine what God is extremely incomplete. And the Rambam's felicitous phrase, it's like a fish trying to imagine life on dry land. We just can't get it. We just can't fully understand what God is like. And then later, Hein Ela Ktsot. These are but Ktsot Rachav. The degree to which we can glimpse God is merely only that. Uma shemetz devar nishma bo v'ra'am gvurotav mi yitboned. What we can understand him is merely a reflection, a shadow, a mere whisper. Who can absorb the thunder of his mighty deeds? Who can fully understand what God is and how he runs the world? Here's the Midrash. The Midrash says two different things. They're both playing off of Parshat Truma, the notion of creating a Mishkan, creating a space in which God's presence will dwell on earth. Vasu Aron Atzei Shittim. Make the Aron, make the ark. Achahu Dichtiv. This is what that pasuk is talking about. Shakai lo matzanuhu sagi koach. God is so great that we can't really fathom him. Amar Rabbeinu Hagadol, tzrichem anu lahachazik tova le'Eov. We really owe a great debt to Eov. Shekol ma she'amar alihu, bahu v'hosif al dvarav. Amar Eov l'chaverav, ma atem sovrim. Shekol ma she'amartem hu kol shivcho, mi yochal lesaper kol shvachav. Who can ever fully praise God? This is an idea that we have in brachot and in tefillah and prayer, that we should be careful to only articulate praises of God within the kind of formulas that Chazal set forth. Because if we were to, in fact, try to praise God on our own, we would find our abilities very limited. And we would become either tongue-tied or we would do an inadequate job of it. Kol hadvarim shedibartem, hein ele ktsot rachav. This is but the tippy toes, the fingertips, the most minuscule portion of understanding God's mighty ways. Ba'ali huva amar shekai lo matzanuhu sagiko. Who can ever fully understand the mighty and powerful God? Misha shomea hapasuk hazeh omer shema chalifu chas v'shalom ela kach amar alihu lo matzinu koach gvurato shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu im briotav she'ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu bo b'tirchot im briotav lo ba'al ha'adam ela lefi kocho. That when God reveals himself directly or indirectly to us limited creatures, us, we whose ability to fully understand God is always going to be limited, God never fully reveals himself, because it would be overwhelming. אתה מוצא כשנתן הקדוש ברוך הוא את התורה לישראל, אילו היה בעל עליהם בחוזק כוחו, were God to have revealed himself fully at the revelation, at the giving of the Torah, lo hayu yicholim la'amod, we wouldn't be able to stand it. Shneimar, im yosfim anachnu l'shmoa et kol Hashem Elokeinu od v'matenu, v'matnu. Right? Were he to fully reveal himself, we'd be overwhelmed, we'd be destroyed. Ela lo ba'alehem, ela lefi kocham. He only reveals himself to us to the degree to which we have the power, the capacity to experience him. Kol Hashem b'koach. Shneimar kol Hashem b'koach. B'kocho eino omer ela b'koach. B'kocho shel kol echad ve'echad. The voice of God comes, it's a kind of midrashic reading of the pasuk. The pasuk literally means that God's voice comes with great power. But it's read as if to say God's voice comes to us to the degree that we are able to hear it. It's our limitation, not his. That's the first part of the midrash. It's a kind of tzimtzum. God contracts himself, because were he to fully give forth, it would be like trying to, what's that old expression about trying to drink from a fire hose? It would be like trying to stand under Niagara Falls in order to get a drop of something to drink. Right? You'd be washed away. That's a kind of contracting of himself in order to make himself known to us. Davar acher. Now here's the second midrashic reading of the idea. Shakailo matzanuhu sagi koach b'shasha amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu leMoshe. How great is God, is his mighty power. When God told Moshe, Asali mikdash, make for me, asuli mishkan, make for me the mishkan, make for me the tabernacle. Etchil matnea v'omer kvodo shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu molei elyonim v'tachtonim. God fills the entirety of the upper and the lower, the heavens and the earth. But he wants a little house. He wants a little place to live. How can you fit the infinite into the finite? V'od hayam mistakel v'ra'eh sheshlomo omedu v'oneh beit hamikdash shehu gadol min hamishkan. And when Shlomo built the temple in Jerusalem, which is true, was larger than the Mishkan, but relative to infinity, it's just a drop in the bucket. V'amar lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, a drop in the ocean. V'amar lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, ki ha'umnam yeshev Elokim al ha'aretz, hine ha'shamayim u'shmei ha'shamayim lo yichuchu. Af ki ha'bayit hazeh asher baniti. Shlomo turns to God and says, are you really going to dwell amongst us here in the Mishkan, down here on earth? The heaven and the higher heavens can't contain you. How much more so this little house which we built? Amar Moshe Uma Beit HaMikdash Hu Yoter V'Yoter Min HaMishkan Shlomo Omer Kain. So if the Beit HaMikdash, which is significantly larger than the Mishkan, can't contain him, the Mishkan Alachat Kama V'Kama, how much more so? L'kach Amar Moshe Yoshev B'Seiter Elyon. Also a pasuk in Tehillim, that God dwells in the higher realms. B'tzel Shaka Yitlonan, in the shadow of the Almighty. Omer Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Simon, Yoshev B'Seiter Hu Elyon. The one who dwells hidden is the one that dwells on the Most High. Mahu B'tzel Shakai B'tzal El. The architect of the Mishkan, his name was B'tzalel, in the shadow of God. B'tzel Rachum, B'tzel Chanun, Ein Ktiv Kan, Ela B'tzel Shokai, B'tzel Shasa B'tzalel, V'kach ne'emar B'tzel Shakai Yitlonan. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Lo Kashem Shata Savur, Kach Ani Savur. I think differently than you, says God. Ela Esrim Keresh B'tzafon, V'esrim B'darom, 20 planks length on the north, 20 on the south, V'chet B'marav, and 8 along the side. this finite, fenced-in parameter, v'lo ela she'ered, that I, God says, as it were, I will descend, v'atzamtzem shchinati, and I will contract down my holy presence into finite space. Betoch ama al ama, a meter squared, as it were. So this, Lawrence Kaplan points out in this essay about what the Rav is doing with the Kabbalistic sources. This is the source he's drawing on, not the Lurianic Kabbalah, but the Midrashic use of the concept, which predates the Kabbalistic concept, so that he's not actually even being Kabbalistic. Don't be confused, as many people who read the essay are, although there are other places where the Rav does utilize Kabbalah. Even here, he's not doing that so much. Let me just 1 second. I'll come back to your comment in a second. And he points out that the Rav ma'adif et hamuvan she'ish halacha miyaches l'musag tzimtzum, prefers the Halakhic Man's reading of the concept of Tzimtzum, which we're about to explore more deeply, al pnei hamuvan she'ish hasod, the mystical interpretation. V'lo rak shema'adif et havanat tzimtzum shel ish halacha ela af mizdaheh ita, and it's not just that he prefers it, but he identifies with the rabbinic understanding of what this is, because it's the understanding of what the Kabbalah is. Let me just read these comments that have come in. Aryeh Baruch, who apparently is a mathematician, posted something in the comments about mathematical theory and infinites, which I have really no idea what any of that is, but I take him at his word. Aryeh, perhaps you can direct our attention to some kind of more detailed explanation of this for the layman. But if what you're writing is, I'm sure what you're writing is true, it certainly would be an interesting insight into these topics based upon modern mathematical theory. So if you have anything you can send us that a simple math ignoramus such as myself can understand, I'd be happy to read it, as I'm sure would others. Here we go. This mystery of Tzimtzum starts section 9. I suppose something in the link, but if there's something on the web that you can send to everyone, it's probably better than recommending a book, even if it's just a kind of summary of something. This mystery of Tzimtzum, of contraction in the Halakha, does not touch upon questions of cosmogony. Cosmogony is the origins of the universe. And he's not talking about that question from the Kabbalistic sense. Unlike the Kabbalists and mutatis mutandis, that's Latin for what we call lahavdil, Philo, Plotinus, the Neoplatonists, the Renaissance philosophers, the Halakha does not concern itself with metaphysical mysteries. We are not mystics here. We're not Kabbalists here. The Halakha, again, Halakha being used as a kind of catch-all for authentic Jewish philosophy, is not mystical, nor does it inquire into that which is too remote for it regarding the creation of the universe. The law of Halakha is a practical utilitarian one. Therefore, one should not compare the concept of Tzimtzum Halakha with the concept as it appears in mystical doctrine. And then he makes a point here in the note 54 that to whatever degree he is talking about those concepts, he's talking really about as they appear in the Tanya, the foundational work of Chabad Hasidut. But I'll leave that for now. The mystic sees the existence of the world as a type of affront, God forbid, to God's glory. So in other words, after saying that his take on Tzimtzum is the rabbinic take, the pre-Kabbalistic take, nevertheless he now goes on to explain the mystic worldview. For the mystic, for the Kabbalist, creation could only come about by God removing himself in order to have space in which to form the created universe. That was a kind of sacrifice on God's part for our good. But it means that built into creation, there was this movement of God away. The creation of the vacuum into which creation could be poured was an affront to God. That's why the mystical worldview has a problem with creation. Why it sees something negative in the physical world. Whose worldview is that? Don't you recall? I hope somebody can answer that question. No? Who wants to escape the physical world? His name isn't spiritual man, his name is religious man, homo religiosus, correct. Now you remember, let me just, I'm calling up this chart. Where is it? There you go. Remember this chart. If at this point you can't fill this in your sleep, you really need to do a little review. Homo religiosus is attempting to escape the material world, to transcend the material world in order to reach the world of the spirit. The cognitive man, the scientist, is oblivious to the world of the spirit and lives only in the exploration and the occupation of the material world. Halakhic man, who obviously, as opposed to cognitive man, does recognize the world of the spirit, is attempting through the halakha to bring the spirit down into our world, the arba amot of halakha, which is the reality. So it's a kind of mirror image of homo religiosus. But homo religiosus, religious man, who the Rav here seems to be identifying as the mystic, as the Kabbalist, sees something inherently negative in the created world. And that's why he is attempting to transcend it, to escape it. Not so Halakhic man. So the mystic sees the existence of the world as a type of affront, because it constitutes a space in which God had to remove himself from. The cosmos, as it were, impinges upon the infinity of the Creator. The Kabbalah senses and emphasizes, again, if there's anybody who, this concept, this term Kabbalah, this kind of catch-all phrase for Jewish mysticism, which is an ancient tradition, but is usually associated with a school of mystical thought centered around Sfat in the 16th century, in the latter part of the 16th century, led by the Ari, by Rav Yitzchak Luria. That's the kind of Kabbalah that we are generally talking about, the brand, or the branch rather, of Kabbalah that we're often talking about. If anybody needs more on that, so presumably there's plenty of material that you can get to. You may see that I am not recommending anything in particular, but it's a whole different orientation and you should fill in the blanks of your education as need. Thank you. I see Aryeh is posting some links in the chat to some of that math stuff. The Kabbalah senses and emphasizes with the anguish of Shchinta Begaluta, the divine presence in exile, the glory of God that emerged from the hiddenness of infinity, that became embodied in the creation of the cosmos, that became contracted in it and by it. The creation of the world constitutes a type of waiver on the part of God of his own glory. For he is holy and separate from all the worlds, and no thought can grasp him. The cosmos is a revelation of God's grace, for his Shekhinah, his divine presence, clothes herself with worlds in order to give them life and impart existence to them. Let's skip ahead a drop. The mystical doctrine here. The mystical doctrine contemplates existence from a pessimistic perspective, and the ontological ideal is not its ultimate end. It senses and emphasizes with the anguish of the Shekhinah. The mystic sees that the Shekhinah, the divine presence, had to remove itself in order for the world to be created, and then had to contract itself down in order to fill a small finite space in the Mishkan. It longs to rise up together with her from the narrow straits of reality and cleave to the Most High God, who is exalted, lofty, separate, all alone, and not manifest in any other being. This, according to mystical teaching, is the glorious and exalted eschatological vision. Eschatology, the end of days. In that day, the Lord will be one, and his name one. Yomahu yeh Hashem echad u'shmo echad, as we say at the end of Aleinu, the pasuk from Zechariah. And every day the mystic prays for the fulfillment of this aspiration, as he recites before the performance of any commandment, Hineni muchan umzuman l'kayem mitzvat aseh l'shem yichud kudsha brichu. When we do the mitzvot according to the Kabbalistic worldview, we are reuniting God, unifying him with the Shekhinah. We're serving to repair that original breach, that original affront. That's the purpose of mitzvot according to the Kabbalistic worldview. The desire of mystical doctrine, again, I've skipped ahead towards the bottom of page 51. The desire of mystical doctrine is to free both man and the Shekhinah, the divine presence, from the world and from the visible reality which is imprinted with the stamp of the supernal. Supernal, that which is above. Right? The alignment of the mystical worldview, the Kabbalistic worldview, with what until now he has identified merely under this general title of homo religiosus. On the other hand, Halakhic Man does not chafe against existence. Rather, he reads with the simplicity and innocence that is typical of him. The verse in Genesis, and God saw everything that he had made, v'hinei tov ma'od. Creation is good. Why would we have a negative attitude towards it? And as we described last time, the description of the biology, that is, given that we're created with needs and desires and impulses of all types, since we're created that way, they can't be inherently sinful. It does not mean, it doesn't give us license to satisfy every whim at every moment. Quite the contrary. Part of the halakhic agenda is to tame our impulses, to exercise a kind of control, a kind of self-control. But the impulses themselves are not inherently sinful or evil, particularly if properly directed. They can be sanctified. And again, as opposed to other worldviews that saw some of those desires as sinful, as tameh, as impure, as polluting, The same thing with creation. The Halakhic man, the Halakhic worldview, sees creation the same way that God does. And the Rav here says, simplicity, typical simplicity and innocence. V'hinei tov ma'od, creation is good. It has to be that the world is good, and we should not be anxious to find a way to transcend it. Halakhic man accepts its verdict. He does not wish to free himself from the world. And he knows nothing about the idea of shvinta begaluta. He's unaware of this kind of Kabbalistic notion that we want to try to make a metaphysical escape from this world in order to reunite God and His divine presence together into the kind of pre-creation state. He is completely suffused, Halakhic man, at the top of page 52, is completely suffused with an unqualified ontological optimism. The worldview is optimistic, and is totally immersed in the cosmos. In that way, we're like cognitive man. On the contrary, in that way, Halakhic man is like the scientist. On the contrary, as he sees it, the task of man is to bring down the divine presence to the lower world, to this vale of tears. The mystery of TZIMTZUM should not precipitate metaphysical anguish, but rather gladness and joy. And that's what Kaplan meant in that phrase, that it's not TZIMTZUM, God removing himself away from something, but TZIMTZUM, his movement into the world, that God manifests himself through creation. And that's why Halakhic man looks at the created world through the prism of halakha, of this kind of superimposing the Jewish worldview onto the created world, as we described quite poetically in those previous passages. And so that's what creates gladness and joy. Because TZIMTZUM is not God removing himself from the world, but it's God manifesting himself in the world. Man resides together with his Creator in this world, and it is only through cultivating that togetherness in the here and now that man can acquire a share in the world to come. The creation of the world does not inflict any blemish upon the idea of divinity, the exact opposite of the Kabbalist worldview. I'll skip ahead again, and there's this one of the more well-known passages in the Halakha is a story. Reb Simcha Zelig was the Dayan in Brisk. He was a student and friend of Reb Chaim. Reb Chaim, again, was Reb Chaim Soloveitchik. Rabbi Soloveitchik's grandfather was the Rav in the town of Brisk. And in the town, the Dayan, the rabbinical judge, was Reb Simcha Zelig Rieger, was his name. So Reb Simcha Zelig related the following incident to the Rav. Once, he and Reb Chaim visited someone's house in Vilna. While they were waiting for their host to appear, Reb Chaim glanced through some works of Chabad Hasidut that were lying on the table. You remember Reb Chaim, he was not a Chassid. The books apparently discuss the question of God's motivation in creating the world and cited two opinions. 1. God created the world for the sake of his goodness. 2. God created it for the sake of his grace. Reb Chaim turned to Reb Simcha Zelig with utter seriousness and told him, both views are incorrect. The world was created neither for God's goodness, nor for the sake of his grace, but for the sake of his will, his ratzon. This view, set down by Maimonides, is a firm principle in the God of the Perplexed, and prevalent in many forms of voluntaristic religious metaphysical systems. Let me just look up this source. Yeah, so this is in the Guide for the Perplexed, Part 3. Hold on. Sorry. Part 3 in Chapter 13 and Chapter 25 of the Guide to the Perplexed, which is, of course, available in English translation online, for those that want to pursue it. That the purpose of creation was because God desired to create the world. Since God's desires are good, the world is a reflection of that. And therefore, we who are placed here should understand that should represent a kind of worldview that we ought to bring to creation. I'm going to skip ahead quite a bit now. I'm at the top of page, I'm in the middle of page 57. So Aryeh, this is for you, if you are the mathematician. The statement of Galileo that the great book which ever lies before our eyes, that is, I mean, the universe, is written in mathematical language, and the characters are triangles, circles, and other geometrical figures, applies as well to the halakha. This idea that mathematics, and I've already admitted earlier that I'm something of an ignoramus when it comes to mathematics. Remember, there's a distinction between, we were very imprecise as school children. Don't confuse arithmetic and mathematics, although they're obviously related fields. When I say I'm an ignoramus about mathematics, it doesn't mean that I can't figure out the percentage of something or do long division. Right? But mathematics is a much higher science. Galileo had this famous statement that mathematics is the language with which the universe is written, as it were. That applies as well to the halakha. And again, here we have this notion, which we've discussed in the past, of the Ravs identifying Halakhic Man to a certain degree. This is the manner in which Halakhic Man is much closer to the scientific worldview than the conventional religious worldview, which until now we had been kind of identifying somewhat with Christianity in some ways, but tonight already we're seeing that there's also this overlap with within the Jewish tradition, within the mystical, Kabbalistic worldview. But to a certain degree, halakha is written not in poetry, but in mathematics, in the formulaic, in the sense of a mathematical formula. Not for naught, he reminds us that certain Gedolei Torah were well versed in mathematics. The Vilna Gaon tell the translator of Euclid's geometry into Hebrew, Baruch Shlov, to the degree that a man is lacking in the wisdom of mathematics, he will lack 100-fold of the wisdom of the Torah. Not because you need certain. There was this Baruch Shlov who lived in the 18th century, who was connected to the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon, who was, not for naught was he called the Gaon. The Vilna Gaon seems to have been well versed in mathematics, and this Baruch Shlov translated the Euclid's geometry into Hebrew. So the Gaon mentioned to him, this Baruch, that mathematics is a necessary wisdom. Not because in order to understand certain sugyot in Eruvin, you need to know how to calculate the area of trapezoid, but because there are certain forms of chokhmah, of wisdom, which are part of the larger world of wisdom that one needs in order to be a learned person. This statement is not just a pretty rhetorical conceit, says the Lord, that testifies to the broad-mindedness of the God. It's not a kind of, shalosh shudas vort about Torah umada, but a firmly established truth of halachic epistemology. The fundamental tendency of the halakha is to translate the qualitative features of religious subjectivity. And that is a kind of mathematical thinking, right? Go back to our metaphors that we were using about the architect looking at the building and seeing the blueprints kind of superimposed on the actual building, or the musician looking at the musical score and hearing the music in his head in a more ideal way than the symphony orchestra itself is able to play. And remember that music and mathematics are closely related fields as well. That's what he means by mathematics being a kind of language of halakha. Right? Because you have to be able to do that kind of mathematical thinking to translate the qualitative features of religious subjectivity. Right? Mathematics, particularly geometry, right? And remember geometry. You study geometry, that any 2 points can only be connected by one straight line. But geometry represents a kind of ideal. We don't have straight lines in the real world. Right? The world that we live in is not, the physical world has a lot of imprecision. But geometry is this kind of ideal blueprint for physical space. In that same way that halakha is an ideal blueprint for the physical world, the reality of the world. And it creates that kind of objectified, just like geometry creates an objectified ideal, the halakha creates an objectified ideal. A subjective religiosity cannot endure. And this is part of the halachic agenda. Think of all great religious moments. Think of religious acts such as prayer, repentance, joy, simcha that we're meant to feel. These are all subjective experiences. They're all emotional states. The halakha attempts to objectify the subjective, making it external through objectified halakha. But there's this tension. In the past, I've mentioned to you the writings of Rabbi Yitzchak Twersky, Rabbi Soloveitchik's son-in-law, Professor Isidore Twersky, and his discussion of the tension between religion and law, between subjective and objective, between internal and external, and that's the great tension in religion. A subjective religiosity cannot endure. If everybody just kind of did what made them feel good, there'd be no staying power to it. And all of those tendencies to transform the religious act into pure subjectivity negate all corporeality and all sensational religious life and admit man to a pure and abstract world, where there is neither eating nor drinking, but religious individuals sitting with their crowns on their head, Yoshvim, Vatroteim, Brosheim, Benenim, Miziv, Hashchina, enjoy their own, not here Ziv Hashchina, their own inner experiences. He's misquoting intentionally the source. Their own tempestuous heaven storm spirit, their own hidden longings and mysterious yearnings will in the end prove null and void. That religion attempts to create objectified benchmarks which will not squelch or extinguish the inner subjective spiritual experience, but will give it a kind of external objectified framework. Right? That's the tension of prayer more than anything else. And it's a topic we've talked about in the past, so I won't rehearse the whole thing again now. But again, I'll skip ahead here. We're now on page 59. Here towards the bottom. The halakha wishes to objectify religiosity, not only through introducing the external act and the psychophysical deed into the world of religion, but also through the structuring and ordering of the inner correlative in the realm of man's spirit. So that prayer is this kind of fluid state in which is this kind of fluid state in which a person stands in communion before his Creator, but we don't leave it at that. We don't say go up to the mountaintop and let yourself go. We say prayer has to be done in the very concrete, very ritualized manner in which we set out. You stand, you put your feet together, you recite a set text at a set time. The set text has to have a certain formulaic component to it. Shevach, Bakbasha, Hoda'ah. This is Jewish prayer. Last summer, we had a number of sessions about Rabbi Soloveitchik's teaching on prayer, and this is a theme he explored again and again and again. The halakha sets down statuettes and erects markers that serve as a dam against the surging subjective current coursing through the universal homoreligiosis. The halakha is trying to tame the subjective, because that subjective from time to time, in its raging turbulence, sweeps away his entire being to obscure and inchoate realms. Indeed, many halakhic authorities have even sanctioned, after the fact, a mechanical performance of a commandment, one lacking in intention. Right? Not every time we pray is it the magical mountain. Is it thunder and lightning? But yet we still pray, because there's the objectified obligation imposed on us. And if we were to only pray when we felt the Great Spirit upon us, we would discover that the capacity to pray in that way would probably atrophy quite quickly. Then there's a discussion about kavanah v'mitzvot, which I'll skip ahead. And we get to another point, which I'll leave off with for next week. And if you can, I did skip through a lot of this at chapter 9, which I of course encourage you to read on your own. If you can, try to read from page 60 on, because something very interesting happens. There's a story the Rav tells about his father and the shofar and Rosh Hashanah. It's probably the most famous story in Halakhic Man. And it raises the question of the role of emotion in religion. Because even though the halakha and the halakhic man is attempting to not extinguish, but rein in the powerful emotions, through objectifying. I'm sorry, somebody's calling me on me. To rein in those powerful emotions, emotion still does have a role in the religious life. And that's the topic that we'll get onto next week, starting from page 60. My apologies, I have to cut it short here. We'll continue, please God, next week on the topic of the role of emotion in halakha.